You're unbelievable.
Well, today we're debating intelligent design and asking, can evolution explain the bacterial flagellum? Well, it's been over 20 years now since Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box, opened up the debate on irreducible complexity. What is that, you may ask? Well, you're going to find out on today's show as we're debating intelligent design and whether certain types of biochemical machines in the cell are simply too complex to have emerged from a Darwinian process of evolution. Last year, in fact, the Discovery Institute released a video titled Revolutionary, Michael Behe and the Mystery of Molecular Machines, which claimed that his irreducible complexity challenge has yet to be answered. And the claim has often been made of one particular biochemical machine, the bacterial flagellum. It acts as a sort of outboard motor, but intelligent design theorists say that the parts that compose it and the way they intricately work together defy a sort of piecemeal approach to the way that evolution shapes organisms. Whereas those who critique intelligent design say that intelligent design proponents are giving up way too early and that arguments around irreducible complexity and the bacterial flagellum have now been refuted. Well, as we revisit this topic today, I'm joined by Jonathan McLatchie, who's a biologist himself in academic research and a proponent of intelligent design. He's also involved generally in Christian apologetics and runs the Apologetics Academy. That's at apologetics-academy.org. And our other guest on the line today is Keith Fox. Keith has been on the show before a number of times. He's Professor of Biochemistry at Southampton University. He's also a Christian, but he believes evolution is perfectly compatible with Christian faith and remains the best explanation for the diversity of life, including biochemical machines. And if you want to find out more about Keith, he's the Associate Director at the Cambridge Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. He's also very involved in Christians and Science too. So welcome along, both Jonathan and Keith, back to the programme today. Perhaps we'll start with you, Jonathan, as you're the one who is in a sense bringing the more controversial side of today's topic to us. Before we get into the facts of irreducible complexity and so on, let's reintroduce yourself. How long have you been kind of involved in looking into intelligent design and sort of, in a sense, being an advocate, a proponent of it?
Well, ever since I did my undergraduate degree in forensic biology at University of Strathclyde, I've been absolutely fascinated by the study of molecular machines and the information bearing, processing, retrieval apparatus and systems that we find run the show in biology. And I was often struck as an undergraduate at how someone could go through a 4-year university program in the natural sciences and come out an atheist at the other end, because to my mind, as far as I'm concerned, the evidence is so compelling for the truth of theism. There's evidence of design both in the physical and in the life sciences. And so I've been involved with groups like the Discovery Institute and the Centre for Intelligent Design in the UK as well. And then I went on to do a master's degree in evolutionary biology at the University of Glasgow. And I've also done a master's degree at the University of Newcastle in molecular biology as well.
But obviously this particular viewpoint you hold isn't frankly welcomed in very often in academic circles. And I know that people like the person I mentioned, Michael Behe, at the outset there, while he's got tenure, others who do propose these kinds of things and don't have a sort of secure footing in academia, they can get into trouble for those beliefs.
Oh, absolutely right. And there's a really great documentary that's been produced on that theme called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, starring the American comedian Ben Stein, which documents many of these cases. But there's certainly enough cases for an Expelled too, because there's many, many cases that have happened since then.
You're a really interesting person yourself, Jonathan. I've said it before, but you have almost a photographic recall. And I don't know what it is about the way your brain works, but you seem to be able to recall facts and quotes and long pieces of scripture and things like that, which I don't have a hope of doing. One thing you told me before we came on air is you also play blindfold chess. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure I've even heard of blindfold chess, but tell me what that is. So
blindfold chess is where you have one player that's blindfolded and he wears a blindfold or turns his back to the board or what have you, and the other player plays his moves on the chessboard and tells you what he played in chess notation, and then the blindfolded player will visualize the position and the board in his head and announce what he's playing, so the other person will move his pieces for him.
So you have to literally remember where everything keeps changing on the board, right, in your head,
yeah,
and just trust that you're not misremembering,
right,
but to know what the next thing is to play.
When you've played a lot in tournament chess, then the board, visualizing the board comes second nature to you.
And is the other person blindfolded as well?
Usually I would play blindfold against weaker players, and so they would have the board in front of them.
I see.
And
so
I'd
it's
be
a kind of it's a handicap in a sense.
Right.
It's saying, okay, I'm going to do this so that I'm not quite as. Anyway, we're not talking about chess on the programme today, but it gives you a sense of the kind of person Jonathan is. We're talking about certainly complex things, though, and irreducible complexity is the thing we're going to be debating on the show today. Keith Fox joins us as well. Keith, welcome along. Welcome back to the programme.
Thank you, Justin. Good to be with you again.
It's great to have you back. Keith, when did you first stumble upon intelligent design, and specifically Michael Behe and his particular work in terms of irreducible complexity?
I first read Michael Behe's book very soon after it came out, and I have to say, initially, I thought that the argument was one that had some attraction to it. As somebody who's also keen on apologetics and integrating my scientific understanding with my deep Christian faith, I have to say, though, that the more I looked at it, the more I thought actually it wasn't a helpful explanation of the way in which complex biological systems had emerged. And then got into looking a little bit more at the evolution of how these things might have come about. So I come from a background of having had some sympathy to start with. Clearly, as a Christian, I see God's hand in everything as the creator and sustainer of the whole universe, right from the atomic to the cosmological. But the more I investigated intelligent design, the less I was convinced that it actually held together as a scientific explanation.
In that sense, you are a theistic evolutionist, or you might call yourself a different label, a creationary evolutionist, or whatever it might be.
Evolutionary creationist is another
creationist.
word. But it's somebody essentially who accepts evolution as the best explanation for the complexity that we see in the biological systems, and yet has a deep Christian faith at the same time.
And overall, you feel that intelligent design is a bit of a dead end in terms of the way that people like Jonathan use it as a sort of an apologetic strategy for showing that there is design in nature and therefore a designer.
Yes, I think it is a bit of a dead end to me. It's, if you like, it's an offshoot from natural theology, which is a very honourable apologetic tool. But I'm not sure where it gets us in terms of the science. In terms of science, it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't lead to any scientific hypotheses that are in any way useful. In terms of the theology, I have some deep questions about what it actually says about how God works in the world. So I would say it's a bit of a dead end, really.
Right. Well, look, we're going to have, I think, a really fascinating but I think, respectful engagement today, because what I like about you, Keith, is even though you disagree overall with intelligent design, you're still very prepared to engage with people who are proponents. Honestly, I've often reached out to others who say I'm just not prepared to give it the time of day, frankly. But you feel at least, Keith, that there's a discussion worth having here, even if you strongly disagree with someone like Jonathan.
Yes, I strongly disagree, but he's a fellow Christian who's coming to things with his own integrity. I come to it with mine. We reach different viewpoints, but neither of us is, I hope, trying to be either stupid or obstructive. So let's just have a good, reasonable conversation.
Well, that's what we're all about here on Unbelievable. So we're going to do that in the rest of today's programme. Hope you enjoy what's to come as we discuss intelligent design and ask, can evolution explain things like the bacterial flagellum, irreducible complexity? But I'd like your opinions on this too. Do email in unbelievable@premier.org.uk. We try and read as many emails as we can at the end of each show. You can also, of course, send in your thoughts via our social media @UnbelievableJB, to reach me via Twitter, facebook.com/UnbelievableJB to follow the show on Facebook. Those links and, of course, more ways to comment underneath today's show, share the programme on, and all sorts of other things from the website too. premierchristianradio.com/unbelievable.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.
So we're talking about intelligent design today. The bacterial flagellum is often cited as one example of a biochemical machine which appears to defy, according to intelligent design theorists, standard evolutionary methods of the way that organisms come together. And it was, of course, one of the examples that Michael Behe used in his best-selling book, Darwin's Black Box, over 20 years ago. And as I mentioned, the intelligent design community, the Discovery Institute in particular, put out a film last year, Jonathan, in which they said that basically Michael's irreducible complexity idea simply hasn't been answered satisfactorily by his critics over the years. Tell us, first of all, then, how you define yourself, intelligent design, Jonathan, and then come to the specific what example we're talking about here, the bacterial flagellum, which may be familiar to some but may be completely new to other listeners.
So intelligent design really is the study of patterns in nature which are best explained by an intelligent cause. That is to say, they bear the hallmarks of intelligent agency rather than stochastic processes such as chance and necessity. So my first degree, as I mentioned earlier, was in forensic science, and forensic science, of course, is a discipline of design detection, right? We want to know whether a fire was a result of natural causes or whether it was a result of arson. Was it deliberate? Was it intentional? And did someone die of natural causes or were they murdered? That's a design inference. And so design detection is already a part of the scientific enterprise, I would argue. And so intelligent design is based on an inference to the best explanation from multiple competing hypotheses. That's just to say it's based on the historical abductive method, which is the mode of reasoning that scientists use when investigating the past, because obviously we can't repeat the past, it's already happened, and so we have to infer to the best explanation based on the evidence available to us. So irreducible complexity specifically was an idea actually put forward by Charles Darwin himself in his 1859 book On the Origin of Species, where he put forward a potential test that which could potentially falsify his thesis of evolution by natural selection. And he wrote in The Origin of Species, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Because Darwin's theory of selection and chance variations, which we now know to be the result of mutations in DNA, basically insists that evolution happens in a stepwise manner. It happens by tinkering of pre-existing systems. It happens by building one advantageous step on another to acquire new functionality and to adapt to environments.
And we often refer to this in almost anthropomorphic terms, as though evolution is doing something and arranging the bits. Of course, people who believe in evolution don't see it that way. This is a purely, in a sense, random process, but by a kind of this natural law of evolution, the things that help stay and the things that don't help disappear, as it were. But that takes, if the theory is true, literally billions of years for any new organisms to adapt and become viable and so on.
And evolution is a fundamentally mindless process. It's unguided. There's not a designer that's guiding it towards an intended outcome, but it's unguided. You've got chance variations acted on by natural selection, and so it's a fundamentally non-intelligent process that we're talking about here. Now, as you mentioned earlier, in the late 90s, Michael Behe came along with his book, Darwin's Black Box, where he purported to take up Darwin's challenge and point out certain systems which he argued were irreducibly complex in that same sense that Darwin talked about in The Origin of Species. So Behe wrote, and he defined irreducible complexity in the following way. By irreducible complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Now, that challenge has been taken up by various scientists trying to rebut Behe's ideas. I think one of the most promising ways of addressing irreducible complexity from a Darwinian standpoint is to argue that what I often call incremental indispensability. That is to say that you add a part to a system, and by rendering or modifying or rendering functionless other components, modifying or removing other components, you can render a protein essential that was originally only helpful. And so
Well, let's come to that, because in a sense, I want Keith to be the one to kind of give the rebuttal, as it were, to the idea. I have obviously been talking about this specific example of the bacterial flagellum, and we will come to Keith in a moment. But I did want to give something that's tangible, because sometimes these ideas are a bit nebulous and abstract for most people to latch onto. But I think it was really helpful that this particular little bit of biochemical machinery has come to represent, in many ways, the argument for irreducible complexity. Can you explain what a bacterial flagellum is, what its purpose is, and how the parts interact together in such a way that people like yourself and Behe claim it is irreducibly complex?
Right. So the bacterial flagellar motor is a rotary motor that propels many bacteria through medium, and they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. The paradigm system for studying, in particular, the assembly of flagella are the gamma proteobacteria, which includes Salmonella or Escherichia coli and things like that. And it's a rotary outboard motor, but it's unlike anything in human technology. In Salmonella or E. coli, it's spinning at speeds of about 17,000, 18,000 RPM, rotations per minute. In some species like Vibrio cholera, it's spinning at speeds of up to 100,000 RPM.
Gosh, that's mind-boggling, really.
Yeah. And it's got energy conversion efficiency of about 100%, and it's plugged into a very elegant...
And this is obviously a tiny thing. It's literally composed, the constituent parts are proteins, the sort of almost smallest things you can get that are physical in terms of building stuff.
Right, exactly. And it's plugged into an elegant signal transduction circuit, so it's getting feedback from the environment. We call it chemotaxis. And what's really amazing about the bacterial flagellum is that it builds itself from the inside out. And so it's got assembly instructions, and the timing of the expression of the proteins necessary to construct and build the flagellum are very well controlled and regulated, so that you get the proper expression at the right times and places.
And just give us a few of what these various parts are, as it were, of the flagellum.
So, for example, you've got the base of the flagellum, and you've got the propeller, or what's called the filament, and the filament itself ends in a pentagonal disc shape called the fly D, which is the filament capping protein. And the fly D, the filament capping protein at the end, basically folds the flagellum monomers that make up the propeller, because the tube through which they have to travel is so narrow that these flagellum monomers have to be literally unfolded for insertion into the channel and then refolded at the distal growing end. And so fly D is absolutely known to be essential to the flagellar assembly. But there's much more detail we could go into.
Yes, and so essentially what you're looking at is sort of there's the base of it, you've got the housing, you've got the propeller itself, you've got other elements that have to move in order for it to be able to rotate and so on. And the claim is that if you removed any one of these parts, it would no longer function. All of these parts have to come together in one single organism in order for it to do what it's got to do, and that, in your view, still presents a massive challenge to the challenge Darwin posed himself, as it were. Or
at least that there's an irreducibly complex core of components which are essential to the system's function.
Okay, and you don't see that any sort of other piecemeal explanation, as far as you can see, has yet answered that particular challenge?
That's correct.
Okay, so we've laid it out there. I think we needed to take a bit of time to do that. Let's hear what Keith has to say in response. So, Keith, you're very familiar, I'm sure, with these kinds of arguments, and I know that there are lots of people who have said that they've rebutted them as well. What's your approach to this particular way of looking at the bacterial flagellum and its supposedly irreducibly complex nature?
Well, there's no doubt that the bacterial flagellum is a very complicated piece of molecular machinery with many component parts to it. And at first sight, it's remarkable. But the scientific literature has several accounts in it for ways in which it could have evolved. That's not to say any of these say this is how it happened. We can't go back in time to say. But there are at least plausible mechanisms. I've got papers from PNAS dated from 2007, other ones from scientific reports published in 2018, which say how this could have been assembled from other proteins that have other functions, whether it's type 3 secretory systems, whether it's F1 ATPases, to use some of the scientific lingo, other molecular motors that so it's assembled from other components with other functions in much the same way that I do DIY. Is I find whatever bits of equipment and tools that I've got and make do, and that things are used in all sorts of different ways in biology. functions evolve over time. So proteins that would have had one function come together in an assembly within that remarkable bacterial flagella structure, and to have a different function when combined together. And we were talking as though there's one bacterial flagellum. Actually, there are many different types of them in different organisms, and the number of proteins that are common to all of them is actually, I think if I'm right, there's over 40 proteins in the E. coli one, and probably only 20 of those are common across most bacteria. So the intelligent designer's actually got quite a bit of work to do of redesigning the flagellum quite a number of times in the whole process as well. So it's the very fact that that science has said here is a plausible mechanism by which it could have arisen. I think also we sometimes conflate the two different things. One is the assembly of the bacterial flagellum, which we do know how that happens. And Jonathan quite nicely went through some of the complexity of that. The assembly is one thing, and the evolution of it, and how that over time those proteins have come to be and to be controlled, is a different question. And they're not the same question in terms of intelligent design.
Just going back to what you were saying about the way that different parts can have other functions, as it were. I know that Kenneth Miller, who's one of the maybe key critics of irreducible complexity, and Michael Behe, he's likened it to the analogy that's given of a mousetrap sometimes by people like Behe, who says you need all of the parts of a mousetrap: the spring, the trap, the bait hook, the board it's on, and so on, in order for it to do what it does. Take away one part, it won't do what it does. And he says that may be true, but I can take away, say, the spring and the bait hook, and it still functions as a tie clip. There's other things that these things are good for, and therefore that's an explanation of how we may get to the position of something complex, even though the individual parts may be serving other purposes in the process.
Yes, that's roughly what I was trying to say, is that the base of the mousetrap could well be a doorstop, and as you said, other parts could be a tie clip or a spring. So biology works by bringing things together that have had other functions, rather than them coming into being just for that one function in the first instance. It's a process called exaptation, to use its technical term. And it's there in all kinds of areas of biology and molecular sciences.
So how do you respond to exaptation then, Jonathan? Because that's, I think, the main sort of rebuttal that is given these days for irreducible complexity and things like the bacterial flagellum.
Well, there's absolutely no question that many of the components in the flagellum have other purposes. He mentioned, for example, the type 3 secretion system, which is involved in secreting toxins or poisons into multicellular organisms. For example, Yersinia pestis, which is the causal agent of bubonic plague, has a type 3 secretion system, but doesn't have flagella. And Salmonella does have flagella, but also has a type 3 secretion system for injecting poisons. So certainly there are components of the bacterial flagellum which have other purposes in other systems, but that doesn't explain how they got to be arranged in this system. Similarly, with the mousetrap example, yes, you could use the base perhaps as a doorstop, and you could use portions of it as a tie clip or something, as Ken Miller has tried to argue. But the question is, how did those components get together and assembled to form?
How did something that was a doorstop and a tie clip end up being used to trap rodents?
Right, exactly. And you've got to explain the interface compatibility between these components, and so it's going to require multiple coordinated changes to explain how one goes from one system to another system. And if I might briefly just comment on the type 3 secretion system that Keith Fox brought to our attention, there's good evidence, I think, from a wide variety of lines of argumentation that the type 3 secretion system actually is an evolutionary degradation product or byproduct of the flagellar system, rather than it being an evolutionary precursor to the flagellar system. So, for example, the type 3 secretion system is taxonomically restricted to a small set of gram-negative bacteria. Gram-negative bacteria are bacteria which have two membranes, an outer membrane and an inner membrane, whereas flagella are much more widely distributed across both gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria. And also it makes sense in evolutionary terms because the selection for motility precedes the selection for virulence, right? You have to be able to swim through liquid before there's a selective pressure to secrete poisons into multicellular organisms. And also the bacteria that have type 3 secretion systems, such as Yersinia, possess the genes for making flagella, even if no flagella are assembled.
You're losing me a bit here, Jonathan, but this is because I'm just not as much in the literature of the you are. But what's the point of all of that technical stuff? Is it that simply it doesn't match up with the evolutionary sort of process that is being sort of
the type
put
3
out here?
secretion system seems to have come after the origins of the flagellum, so it's an evolutionary byproduct or degradation product,
Right, rather than preceding
Exactly.
it, which is the
Right.
story that someone like Keith needs in order to
Yeah.
create a flip. Okay, I think I get that. We're going to come back to you, Keith, in a moment's time. We're just at the end of part 1 of today's programme. So we'd be debating intelligent design, asking, can evolution explain something like the bacterial flagellum? We've got 2 great guests joining me for today's programme, Keith Fox and Jonathan McLatchie.
Alexandra, does God exist?
I'm sorry, I cannot answer this question.
Well, what is the point of life then?
Please, ask this question to someone qualified. Ideally, human.
Truth is, artificial intelligence and search engines can't really help with some questions, which is why I'd love you to join me, Justin Brierley, at Unbelievable the Conference 2018. Honest answers from an international team of thinkers, including our partners Reasons to Believe, equipping you to share your Christian faith in our skeptical world. Unbelievable the Conference 2018. Your questions answered. London, the 19th of May. Early bird discounts available at premier.org.uk/justask.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome back to the second part of today's Unbelievable. I'm Justin Brierley, and today on the show, we're debating intelligent design and irreducible complexity. I'll be coming back to my guests in just a short moment's time. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can email in unbelievable@premier.org.uk. Always try to leave space at the end of each show to read some of your responses to recent programmes. We'll be doing that at the end of today's programme. And you can find us online on the social media at UnbelievableJB for Twitter, facebook.com/UnbelievableJB. To follow us on Facebook, leave me your thoughts there as well. And indeed, today's show available from the website, premierchristianradio.com/Unbelievable. If you can stick with us here on Premier Christian Radio, on the profile between 4 and 5 straight after today's programme, a special tribute to Billy Graham, who passed away at the age of 99 this last week. He was, of course, a famed evangelist, incredibly influential Christian, probably the most influential Christian of the 20th century. And so a special programme marking his life and legacy that I've presented and produced will be played out between 4 and 5 on the profile this afternoon, speaking to friends, family and ministry colleagues from across the decades of his ministry. If you'd like to listen to that anywhere in the world, wherever you are, do go to the Profile podcast and you'll find it as the latest edition on the Profile podcast. And we have a special offer as well. If you'd like the free Billy Graham tribute magazine that we're in the process of producing, then do go to premierchristianity.com/Billy Graham and ask for that free copy of that magazine, which you'll get as soon as it is published. premierchristianity.com/Billy Graham. Okay, time to get back into today's discussion. We're asking, can evolution explain the bacterial flagellum today, over 20 years since Michael Behe's book Darwin's Black Box opened up this whole debate on what's often called irreducible complexity. And we heard in the first section of today's programme my intelligent design advocate on the programme today, Jonathan McLatchie, explaining why he believes Behe was right about the bacterial flagellum, this outboard motor, as it were, of a lot of that exists in a lot of cells, and the fact that you have to have all of the pieces together in one place in order for it to do what it does, and it's very hard to create some kind of evolutionary stepwise program by which this particular piece of biochemical machinery was established. Keith Fox is pushing back on that whole idea today on the programme. He's Professor of Biochemistry at Southampton University, a Christian like Jonathan, but believes evolution is perfectly compatible with Christian faith and remains the best explanation for the diversity of life. So let's come back to you, Keith, because we're getting into the complexity now of this particular issue, if you'll forgive the pun. And the question is, Jonathan's saying this story of, yes, different parts of the flagellum can have different purposes in other systems. The question is, how on earth did they all come together for this particular purpose in this particular system? How do you get to that bit of the story in an evolutionary sort of paradigm, Keith?
So all sorts of explanations to counter what Jonathan just said. One is that we know that bacteria are engaged in things called lateral gene transfer, is that genes are being passed from one organism to another all the time. So it's not as though it has to evolve in a perfect way in one organism. It is that those genes are being mixed around. Secondly, that Jonathan actually, I think, increased the complexity of his own argument by pointing out that these are very different in the many, many different kinds of microorganisms there are. And I think that layers another layer of complexity for the irreducible complexity people. So what is the designer doing in making a system in Yersinia, another one in E. coli, and so on and so on for the thousands and thousands of different types of microorganisms? I would argue that it's not that we know exactly how this has taken place, but there are plausible mechanisms that we can show that say it could have taken place, and you cannot say never say never. In the same way as I think Darwin writing asked questions about, say, the evolution of the human eye, which is extremely complicated, but yet we now know a good deal about how eyes have evolved over time, and that's not an irreducibly complex system. The ways in which biological molecules interact with each other, and Jonathan rightly talked about those interfaces and the signaling mechanisms that connect them. The whole of molecular structures, the whole of molecular biology is based on those sorts of interactions. There's nothing peculiar about the bacterial flagellum in two proteins and many proteins having interfaces that are perfectly matched to bring them together. It's the way in which evolution has brought together over time systems so that they do have these very precise functions. So in a sense, the bacterial flagellum is a bit of a sideline. It's that those sorts of interactions are occurring all the time throughout the whole of cell biology, structural biology.
And in that sense, if Jonathan's going to claim intelligent design in this case, he'd have to be claiming it all over the place when it comes to... Absolutely. The whole of biology is incredibly complicated, from the way in which a cell works. And the bacterium flagellum is just one example of that. You could take the same thing through for eukaryotic, so that's higher complexity cells, and bring out examples of the networks of interactions that occur in them. So that to some extent, I think the bacterial flagellum is a bit of a red herring. Well, in a sense, we're just using it as one.
It highlights the complexity of biological life.
So life just is complex, Jonathan. Yes, the bacterial flagellum is complex, but so is lots of other things, and we're not going to sort of just assume that they're all designed. We're always searching, in a sense, for the explanations that make sense of the complexity we see. And obviously Keith suggested a couple. He's not saying they're definitive, but I think he talked about a lateral transfer and things like this. These, not that I understand what that is, but you may. So do you want to respond to any of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm quite happy to say it's design all the way down. I mean, I'm not just saying that the bacterial flagellum is a product of design, but rather there's design all over biology, and forming new binding interfaces actually, I think, is prohibitively difficult when you require multiple coordinated changes to happen together simultaneously. And this, I would argue, is actually supported in population genetics, which is the mathematical expression of neo-Darwinism. So in population genetics, you can basically calculate the waiting times for mutations to arise based upon the known average mutation rates, the generation turnover times, and the population sizes. And invariably what we see is when we run the mathematics of population genetics, we see that evolution is not good, even in bacterial species where you have massive population sizes, at producing complex adaptations that require multiple simultaneous coordinated changes to actualize or realize this complex adaptation.
And in that sense, you're saying, yes, it is certainly all complicated, Keith, but that's just further evidence that the whole thing is designed from the bottom up or top down or whatever way. I mean, Keith's view, I think, is also simply that you're not giving enough time for them to find ways of explaining these things. That we do, for instance, have ways of understanding the way the eye works, which was at one time considered irreducibly complex. We just have to, be patient as well when it comes to other aspects of the very smallest aspects of biochemistry and so on. What's your response to that we just need to wait for more explanation?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that in regards to any hypothesis, that's shown to be wrong. I mean, I'm not just speculating that this is wrong, I'm actually giving reasons why it's wrong, why in principle the mathematics just don't add up if you insist on this Darwinian stepwise pathway. It's so improbable that you can rule it out as being a plausible explanation given the amount of time that we have. And when we're dealing with systems and more complex.
But people say, well, you've got a lot of time on your hands, billions of years. That's right. The whole point. These things will take a long time to develop, but we do have a lot of time in the history of the Earth. But even that's not enough time as
that's definitely not enough time, especially not in higher organisms, such as in mammals, for example, where you have much smaller population sizes than in bacteria. But I would argue that even in bacteria, you just don't have the times necessary to actualize these complex adaptations.
If what's doing the actualizing is essentially genetic mutation and sort of natural selection, there's not physically enough time to get this kind of level of complexity.
That's absolutely right, yeah.
Keith,
can I come back on some
go
of
ahead.
those things?
Yes, go ahead.
It's that Jonathan made reference to mathematical modelling and computing, etc. And I have to admit that those supporters of intelligent design are overrepresented in the fields of mathematics and computing, and very underrepresented in the whole areas of biology, biochemistry, cell biology. The maths and computing, you can only model on what you know. You have to assume a model of how things could have happened. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you go down that computing line, there are lots of things, lots of mechanisms we haven't the faintest idea about at the moment. But the job of the scientist is to say, give me a mechanism, let me think how it could have happened. To simply say that on the basis of my current knowledge that I can't see how it happened is a scientific stopper. And what drives most scientists on a day-to-day basis is to go into the lab and sit at the computer and think, let me think how this could have happened, even to the extent of saying, how could if the intelligent designer did something, let's give that hypothesis credence for the moment, how did the intelligent designer actually do it? What was the chemistry, the biochemistry of the mechanism, or was it a totally miraculous, spontaneous appearance of something from nothing? There are all those sorts of nuances that come on top of all that Jonathan has been saying.
Yeah, and so in a sense, Jonathan, mathematics may pose problems but at the same time, people like Keith are constantly coming up with new ways of explaining how systems emerge and so on. And so, in a sense, if you've got to give it time to, I think what I'm getting from you, Keith, is that it's all very well to use the sort of the mathematical models to say this doesn't work, but actually at the biological level, stuff happens kind of organically that doesn't necessarily get taken into account by a mathematical model. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I think that is pretty much what I'm saying. There are lots of things coming out outside the biology where we could look at them. For instance, an arched bridge. You look at that and say, well, how did that come about? No, but you need mechanisms for putting it in place that are no longer there. Maybe there was a scaffolding there. Maybe actually the central bricks appeared by some magical levitation mechanism. But you need a model in order to be able to sort of try to describe what's going on. And I think that's happening in biology. There are lots of very complicated systems. The whole of biology is very complicated. Maybe I want to push back on Jonathan and say, ask him just, if he's saying he's seeing design all the way down, what is he allowing of evolution at all? I mean, is he denying the complete evolutionary paradigm right from the bottom up? I know that intelligent design is a very broad church, from those who are effectively ultimate creationists to those who are very, very close to my own view of theistic evolution. What role do you see evolution as playing in the whole thing, Jonathan?
I think that evolution certainly explains some things. It explains very simple things. It explains the appearance, the emergence of antibiotic resistance, for example, in many bacteria. It explains insecticide resistance, and there's a whole bunch of things that it explains. But when you actually look at the molecular level to what's actually going on that accomplishes these innovations or these functional adaptations, we learn that actually it's well within what I would predict to be the boundaries of the evolutionary paradigm. So, for example, a common way of acquiring antibiotic resistance is to modify the target site for the antibiotic, which is not a complex innovation.
Is this what's sometimes called the micro versus macro view of evolution? That microevolution you're okay with at some level, where it's these small changes, but the large kind of more complex elements you just don't think it's capable of doing, Jonathan?
I actually don't make the distinction between micro and macro evolution, because it implies in people's minds that macro evolution is just micro evolution over a greater amount of time, whereas I think that it fundamentally requires different types of evolution to occur in order to get a new body plan, for example, because, and this is a whole debate in itself, I don't think the information necessary to drive the morphogenesis of organismal form, to drive the development of the body plan, exists at the level of DNA. So mutating DNA won't get you to a new body plan.
That's a bit of a side issue maybe, but Keith, for Jonathan, he's saying there are some things evolution can do, but no, I mean, fundamentally at the molecular level, it is intelligent. It does have to involve design from a very early stage, I suppose. And that's a problem for you, Keith?
No, I don't think it is. I mean, I'm pleased to hear that Jonathan doesn't distinguish between macro and microevolution. As far as I can see, what's typically called macro is just microevolution on a big scale. Some evolutionary things are just simple point mutations in the DNA that give a change in the protein sequence. Others arise, since Jonathan raised the whole evo-devo thing, of actually the timing at which genes are switched on and the arrangements, the places that they're placed within the genomes. So evolution is more than just a simple single base change in DNA that leads to something magical going on. It's a very, very complicated system that we're beginning to understand.
Where do you want to go with this next, gentleman? Because obviously we're not going to get you to agree on anything today.
I mean, a couple of things is actually to try to unpick some of the theology behind the whole intelligent design and whether it does make good theology.
Well, I was going to suggest exactly the same. So why don't we go there right away? Because as far as I can see,
related to that is actually the question of bad design.
Indeed. Well, let's talk about the theological aspect of this, because I think from your perspective, Keith, often it's not just that you think that we are going to get satisfactory evolutionary explanations for these things. It's that the intelligent design just seems too ad hoc at some level, or that it's too, if you like, it doesn't look as nice aesthetically as a kind of simple process, if you like, of evolution. You've often said, I think, that it looks like God has to constantly intervene to create lots of different organisms and things. Whereas I think you much prefer at a theological level, at an aesthetic level, the idea of God setting in motion a process by which all of this complexity emerges. That for you is a more satisfactory, fulfilling kind of explanation of the way God would act. Is that correct, Keith?
Yes, I want to be cautious about saying God's setting in motion. That rather sounds like lighting the blue touch paper and retiring. Whereas the classical Christian view of this is that God is immanent in the whole of creation, upholding everything, every moment of time, rather than being detached from the whole of nature, the whole of the created process. If God is a designer in some aspects, then the implication is that other things just happen by quote-unquote natural mechanisms. And I don't think we can unpick those two. The whole of science, the whole of nature is God's. Irreducible complexity brings God down to being the role of the tinkerer, the engineer who's sort of fiddling with a system because it's really not quite good enough as it stands at the moment. And that's not the way I theologically I see as God working in the world.
Jonathan?
That might be the case if you accept common ancestry, but I don't. So I think that God is involved in special creation. I don't see it as a guided form of evolution, but there are other intelligent design proponents such as Dr. Michael Behe or Dr. Michael Denton who would take the view that all of life goes back to single universal progenitor or universal common ancestor. I don't take that opinion, and so I don't see that as a problem from my view.
And you don't see it as a problem, this idea that God is, in a sense, constantly intervening in the biological process?
No, even on a common descent paradigm, I see evidence of sudden infusions of information to the biosphere. I don't think that there's God is in each cell making changes here and there. I mean, I think there's clearly evidence of design at the locus of the origins of life, and also perhaps at the Cambrian explosion. I think we could make a good case for there being an infusion of biological information there, and at different points in the history of life, I think there are infusions of information into the biosphere. But you don't like even this idea of infusions of information and such like, Keith. You think that's too messy? It doesn't feel like the way God would act in a sense.
No, it doesn't. I mean, and you're also then making God explicitly responsible for what I might call evil design. It's the bacterial flagellum. It's involved in the pathogenicity of organisms. So you're invoking God coming into a system to make things more pathogenic, that make them not pleasant at all. You've got various aspects of all kinds of biology where looked at it from the perspective of an engineer is actually bad design. That's the way in which biology and evolution works, is that things just come about, and we could sit down on a piece of paper and design something that might be more efficient, but you then don't have a mechanism to get to that. Biology simply takes what is and uses it. So I think theologically we have all kinds of issues that are exposed by this.
Couldn't it be argued, though, that God is just as morally culpable for evolution if that produces the pathogens and all the things that are wrong, in a sense, with the world, whether he specially designed particular flagellum that also power viruses, or whether he simply allowed evolution to take its course and it did the same?
Yes, I mean, theodicy and explaining suffering and evil in the world is a highly complex thing. But I think intelligent design makes God explicitly involved in the designing of the evil processes. An evolutionary mechanism, if you like, they're a side product of the process of giving free will to living organisms, and that freedom extends to the level of the molecular machines as much as it does to our own minds and wills.
We probably don't have time to unpack the fullness of these heavy, weighty issues. But Jonathan, do you want to do a quick response to this question of, does it make God to blame, in a sense, for pathological diseases if he's literally creating these things in situ?
Well, theodicy, of course, is a whole debate in itself. So it's a very ancient question of why there is evil and suffering in the world, and the question that Keith Fox, I think, is posing is, does intelligent design implicate God in the creation of systems that are designed malevolently? First of all, I don't think that detracts from the reality of, or the ability to detect design in nature. For example, you could infer design in a medieval torture rack that's designed for malevolent purposes, but nonetheless we can infer that it's designed. On the theological question, as a Christian, I am quite happy to say that suffering in the world and malevolent design is the product of human sin, because we live in a fallen world. And the theodicy that I incline towards is that proposed by Bill Dembski in his book The End of Christianity, where he argues that actually the fall in respect to its cause and effect relationship is retroactive. And so the Garden of Eden is a place at which two worlds intersect. You have the world as God, the perfect world, the world without human fallenness and human sin and the curse, and then outside of the Garden of Eden is the world that God has prepared in preparation, in advance of the fall of man. So that's my theodicy on that.
I think it's rather a peculiar view, if you don't mind me saying so, about things being retroactive. Trying to blame everything on the fall is, I think, rather trying to use a get-out-of-jail-free card against any argument. It doesn't make sense to me to say that the fall was retroactive. I can't see any evidence that the fall itself caused any changes in the rest of the the biological or the physical world. It could cause a change in our relationship with God, and it's by virtue of the change in our relationship and the way in which we steward God's world that the rest of the world is in a mess. But that's our fault for being fallen. It's not that somehow Bacterial Flagellum retroactively appeared on the scene because Adam happened to sin. I think it's a form of sophistry to try and make that kind of argument. It just doesn't make sense to me.
In Genesis, God places the man in the Garden of Eden, which implies that the Garden of Eden is a local garden. And after the fall, they are banished from the Garden of Eden into the world where there is predation, there's suffering, and so on. But I see when I read the scriptures that God says when Adam and Eve sin, that the ground is cursed because of you, right? There'll be thorns and thistles and so on. And so I see that as part of the curse from a theological standpoint.
I think we could spend a lot of time talking about interpretation of those first few chapters of Genesis, which would take us several more programs.
It would indeed. And so perhaps that's a good point to call a close to that. Just to say that we'll spend a good 10 or 15 minutes in the next section just starting to draw this together. If you're interested in both of my guests today, let me remind you the ways to find out more about them. Jonathan McLatchie also runs the Apologetics Academy, apologetics-academy.org. And I'm sure there's a lot you could agree on actually together in terms of Jonathan's approach to scripture and the person of Jesus and the resurrection and things like that, Keith. But on this issue, obviously, you part company. Keith Fox is Professor of Biochemistry at Southampton University. Look up the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion to see more of what Keith does and the sorts of issues that they're engaged in, or Christians in Science, which Keith is also very much engaged in. We'll continue and conclude our discussion today in a moment's time. Can evolution explain things like the bacterial flagellum? We're talking irreducible complexity, intelligent design on this week's edition of Unbelievable. He reached over 2 billion people through rallies, books, TV and radio. He was the spiritual advisor to presidents and global leaders. His impact changed the course of Christianity in the UK and the world. And his message led millions to put their faith in Jesus Christ. Billy Graham was this generation's greatest evangelist. In a special free tribute edition of Premier Christianity magazine, read about his life and legacy with a unique range of archive photos spanning decades of ministry. Ask for our free Billy Graham Tribute magazine at premierchristianity.com/Billy Graham. Welcome back to the final part of this week's edition of Unbelievable, the show that gets different points of view together for conversations that matter. Sometimes it's Christians and atheists, or Christians and other points of view. Sometimes it's two Christians debating something, as it has been today. And Jonathan McLatchie actually going to be joining me again next week as he debates Richard Carrier. And if that name is familiar at all, it's because he is the leading light, in a way, of the Jesus mythicist movement. And so on next week's programme, Jonathan McLatchie turns from science to biblical criticism and is going to be defending the historical Jesus. And one of the main contentions of Richard Carrier is that the Apostle Paul never believed in a flesh and blood Jesus, but a celestial Jesus. So we're going to be asking, what kind of a Jesus did the Apostle Paul believe in? If you can tune in again for that next week, then I look forward to you joining me, whether it's by podcast or radio. But I will physically actually be in Canada for the Apologetics Canada conference next week. Very much looking forward to that. I don't know if there are still tickets available. You can obviously go and look at it on the website if you're in that area, in the Vancouver area where it's taking place. But I'm really looking forward to that and hopefully meeting some unbelievable listeners out on the west side of Canada. And also looking forward to chairing the debate on the opening night of the Apologetics Canada conference, when I'll be joined by Justin Trottier and Andy Bannister for a debate on human rights, which we're hoping to put out on a future edition of Unbelievable as well. So there's something to look forward to, and I'm really looking forward to meeting any unbelievable listeners in that neck of the woods. Also, just a quick reminder that straight after today's programme, if you can continue listening, our Billy Graham tribute plays out. It's my interview with many people who knew the man, the great evangelist who passed away this last week, talking to friends, family and ministry colleagues about his life and ministry. If you can listen between 4 and 5, I can highly recommend that. It's a very involved, in-depth programme, but you can also hear it on the Profile podcast. If you go to wherever you get your Profile podcast from, you'll be able to do that, and you'll be able to also pick up a free copy of the Billy Graham Tribute magazine we're producing if you go to our website at premierchristianity.com/Billy Graham. Just a quick reminder that Unbelievable the Conference is Saturday the 19th of May. Early bird tickets finish on the 16th of March, though. Get in there now if you want to book in for what is Europe's probably largest, actually, day conference for apologetics. And we've got just such a fantastic array of speakers joining us this year. Wouldn't want you to miss out. premier.org.uk/just ask. Just a quick shout out to Greg, who gets in touch to say, have you ever considered a show with a Christian and an atheist arguing the opposite position? Well, actually, we've done that show, Greg. That's the joy of having the back catalogue, the archive of shows on the podcast and so on. If you go back a couple of years, I think it was, Randall Rouser, who was our Christian guest, debated, as it were, the opposite side of the coin, defended atheism against Michael Roos, our atheist guest on that occasion, who was happy to try to defend theism, or Christianity specifically. And it was the most interesting show, really worth listening back to. I think you're going back to something like January or February 2016, if memory serves, to get hold of that particular programme. OK, lots of more of your feedback towards the end of today's programme. Right now, let's finish up today's conversation.
You're listening to Unbelievable on Premier Christian Radio.
So we're talking today about evolution and intelligent design. It's a topic we've done a number of times, and we've sort of circled back on today's programme to something that really kicked off the modern day intelligent design movement to some extent back in the mid-90s when Michael Behe published the book Darwin's Black Box and started talking about irreducible complexity, biochemical machines that seem to require a complete sort of assembly, if you like, without some piecemeal evolutionary process in order to do what they do. We've been talking about one of the famous examples of that, the Bacterial Flagellum, on the show today with Jonathan McLatchie and Keith Fox. Jonathan, our proponent of intelligent design today. Keith Fox, who takes, if you like, that is happy to say evolution can and will provide the explanation for these albeit completely remarkable systems. And on that level, Keith, I thought it worth sort of maybe exploring the fact that whether or not you believe in the specifics of intelligent design in cells and so on. I mean, I can imagine most Christians, they look at life as we have it now, conscious, intelligent, sentient beings, being able to reflect on ourselves and our place in the universe. And they would find it hard to swallow a kind of a naturalist atheist perspective, which says all of this came from completely inanimate matter, no purpose involved, no direction involved. At that level, aren't Christians always, in a sense, believing in some kind of an intelligent design, that there's something going on here that brings us to the place we are?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, most Christians would agree that God is the creator. We say it in the creeds every Sunday. It's there in the beginning of John's Gospel. Nothing that has been made was made without him. God is indeed the creator of the whole of the cosmos, as much as the biology that we've been talking about today. That doesn't mean to say that God is the tinkerer, but it is all his, moment by moment, throughout the billions of years of evolutionary and cosmological evolution. Yes, of course, the believer looks at the world and says, this is a remarkable place. You use the word naturalistic and atheistic. I think those are loaded words. I'd actually just use the word scientific explanation of the way the world works, and that God is as much behind the science so we can look at it with a sense of awe and wonder. But the argument for incredulity is not a sufficient one. It is the scientists will always say, that's remarkable. That is actually awe-inspiring. But I want to find out a little bit more about it.
I guess,
let me see if I can understand.
What I was saying in referring to the naturalism, the atheism, is that I anticipate, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you might just as much disagree with an atheistic colleague as you would with Jonathan, who says all of this complexity and the consciousness and everything else, there's absolutely no need for God in the process, because it can all be explained by a purely naturalistic process that doesn't invoke any kind of purpose or anything like that outside of ourselves.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I disagree with an atheist argument much more strongly than I would against Jonathan's one, is that there is purpose and meaning in life. We're not just random incidents and collections of molecules and atoms that have come together. But yeah, we are, as humans, created in the image of God. We might debate what that means. there is purpose to life, there is meaning in the universe. And those are sorts of questions that certainly science can't even begin to answer. It's outside the remit of science.
You said you were surprised yourself, Jonathan, that some of your colleagues in academia were able to remain atheists after seeing what you saw, which for you, even without the knowledge you've acquired since, it made sense, only made sense in terms of a creator, of a God. I mean, what is it? I mean, obviously you believe the evidence points to intelligent design. Even if you weren't convinced of that, if you did take an evolutionary paradigm for everything, would you still say it makes more sense to believe in that in the context of a God than without a God and that kind of thing?
Certainly, the existence of God, I would argue, would still be the best explanation for why there is something rather than nothing. It would still be the best explanation for why the constants and parameters of our universe seem to be very delicately finely tuned for life of any form to exist, and not just that, but so that it is conducive to scientific discovery and measurement, as Robin Collins has recently shown. So I think that there would still be ample reason to think that God exists, but I think that it would be difficult to hold on to the view that it's a theistic God who actually interacts with the world rather than a deistic one who sets the universe going.
Is that what you think an evolutionary paradigm leaves us with then, a more of a deistic God? Obviously Keith doesn't feel that. He says, well, no, I believe in a God who's upholding the whole thing at every moment. You obviously feel that's not the kind of God that it serves.
I've never been quite sure, and maybe Keith can help me out here, what theistic evolution actually means, because to the extent that evolution is theistic, it's not Darwinian, and to the extent it's Darwinian, it's not theistic, and so it seems to me to be an oxymoron.
Keith?
And I think we're playing with words there. Theistic evolution simply says that evolution is the best mechanism on the block for explaining how biological systems have come into being, and that is compatible with a Christian belief in a creator, and that just happens to be the mechanism that he used to bring things the way in which we observe them. So I don't see the playing with words and the difference necessarily that evolution is necessarily opposed to any form of theology.
Your problem with that, Jonathan,
we also have the question of not just how did God interact with the world in time past, but how does God interact with the world now in day-to-day life? How is God involved in my life and the life of the world around me? And a lot of that is not evident. But I do believe that God is upholding the world, the whole thing, moment by moment. It's part of his divine will continually, not just coming in and tinkering with things.
I mean, the problem is that it all depends on how you frame it, because you frame it as, well, God is tinkering, whereas Jonathan sees an evolutionary paradigm as meaning God is a deistic God who doesn't bother to get involved in it any longer with his creation. So
not even God can direct an undirected process. That's not a theological problem, it's just a straightforward logical one, right?
I mean, is that what
I would agree with that, yes.
So do you not term evolution as being about undirected processes then, Keith? What language would you use?
It means scientifically evolution is mutations are a random process, and evolution is not. It's then selection based on that. If the hand of God is in that, quite exactly how we define how God directs that, I think is I think it's beyond the human mind to begin to answer that.
I guess would you be willing at least to say God intended for us humans to be here, that this was what God purposed in the process of evolution?
Oh, absolutely. Whether he purposed that we should be in the anatomical form that we are is another question, but that there should be sentient spiritual beings who are made in his image to look after the world that he's created, that have a relationship with him and with each other. Absolutely, there's divine purpose in all that.
Well, that's not Ken Miller's. That's not Ken Miller's view, because he thinks that God could have used big brain dinosaurs, right? He doesn't. I think. I mean, you talked about not knowing how exactly God directs the process of evolution, but the whole point of Darwinism is that it's not guided, it's not directional. In fact, Darwin was insistent that it was. I mean, his mechanism of natural selection and random chance variation serves as a designer substitute. That is, it explains the illusion or appearance of design without recourse to a designer. So I don't understand how the theistic modifier distinguishes it from a purely naturalistic atheist evolution.
I mean, I come back. I would agree with Ken Miller that we could have been highly intelligent dinosaurs, to put it in a rather crude way. But the point would have been is that beings would have come into existence that had the ability to relate to God, that had moral responsibility, that were sentient and intelligent and conscious, whether that's in the shape of a rather oversized dinosaur or in the human anatomy that we have at the moment, it is almost irrelevant. It's the purpose of being able to relate to God and to be his viceroys within this world.
I have a feeling that a Disney film actually came out which imagined the extinction of the dinosaurs not having happened, maybe the asteroid missed or whatever, and that literally culture today is lots of dinosaur reptilian type people walking around and sort of basically acting like humans. So someone has done that thought experiment somewhere. But in any case, look, we're kind of out of time, and we've got some interesting areas here, talking much more generally about whether theistic evolution is theologically makes sense from Jonathan's point of view, and obviously you've done the same in the opposite direction, Keith, when it comes to intelligent design. So I'm glad that we've managed to circle around not just the technical biological stuff, but also some of the theological issues that emerge from this. As always, great to have you both on. Thank you both for the spirit in which you've engaged the discussion. Wasn't expecting you guys to come out agreeing, but I know that you're both willing to have these frank discussions and still call each other Christian brothers and sisters in the Lord. So thank you very much, Jonathan, for being with us in studio today.
Thank you.
And Keith, thank you for coming on the line again.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you. It's good to meet you, Jonathan.
Likewise. Thanks for coming on and talking to me.
Well, thanks both for being on the programme today. We'll make sure that the links to both my guests, Keith and Jonathan, are available from today's webpage. Again, more about Jonathan at Apologetics Academy, if you look that up. And Keith Fox can be found at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion. And coming up next, some of your feedback to recent editions of the programme.
Unbelievable with Justin Brierley.